everybody, welcome to our curator conversation. I just wanted to let you guys know we will get started in a couple of minutes. We want to give people a minute or two to make sure they're logged in and that everything is working properly. So for the next minute or two, if you can take a second and find the chat box, go ahead and introduce yourselves. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from. And then the other feature we're going to utilize during this program is the Q&A. We've got a lot of people tuning in today, so to make sure that your question does not get lost in the chat box, please submit it in the Q&A box. It should be somewhere near the chat box on your screen. Every screen looks a little different, but if you find that, please submit questions throughout the program. If you find you're having any tech problems, send a message in the chat, and I will try and help you as best I can, and we will get started in about 1 minute.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Andy Talkov. I'm the Senior Director for Curatorial Affairs at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, and I want to thank you for joining us today for our first members-only webinar, Tomorrow's Treasures Today. Now, as a private, nonprofit organization, we depend on your support, and although we are always grateful, we are even more so for the support that many of you have shown us during the past few months as we all react and adapt and adjust to the effects of COVID-19 on our own institution and on our daily lives. And we are really looking forward to reopening your history museum in the coming weeks. I'm so pleased that so many of you were interested in joining us today, and we'll take time at the end of the program after you've heard from me and some of my colleagues to take your questions and comments. But I also wanted to remind everyone that if you are having technical issues and need some help, our colleague Haley is here, and if you just use the chat box to message her, she will get you all straightened out. So in this first program, we wanted to take an opportunity to introduce our curatorial team and to share some of the recent work that we've been doing to build the VMHC collection. So today I'm joined by my curatorial colleagues, Paige Newman, Dr. William Rasmussen, and Dr. Karen Sherry, who you'll hear from in a few moments, and they can introduce themselves a little bit further. As a team, we're all responsible for monitoring, building, and interpreting the collections here at the VMHC through research and programs such as this one, as well as through exhibitions. And our collections are continuously growing. And together, my colleagues and I are responsible for seeking out materials for the collections, as well as fielding offers from donors as we build this really remarkable collection of Virginia history for the use of people today as well as in future generations. The collections of the VMHC include about 9 million items that include letters and diaries and books, broadsides, sheet music, maps, business records, paintings, prints, photographs, militaria, textiles, metalwork, and countless other types of objects. In fact, I think if you can think of it, there may very well be an example of it in our collection. And although we've acquired some items through purchases over our 190-year history, many of the items in our collection have been donated, particularly by members like you and other supporters. Our collection is remarkably broad, and in some cases has areas of great depth. And one of our major goals as an organization is to collect manuscripts, books, periodicals, and objects that will better represent all of Virginia's rich and diverse history, particularly with an eye toward filling gaps in our history that are not as well represented in our collections. So myself, as Senior Director for Curatorial Affairs, I lead the work of our curators, who you'll meet today, and our exhibition team, who are responsible for producing the wonderful exhibitions that we are able to host. My areas of collecting for the museum focus on our archaeological collection, as well as our collection of militaria and firearms. And soon after the museum closed in March, I began to work with a number of my colleagues to initiate an appeal to you and to the general public to begin to share your stories about how you were being affected and how you were reacting to the COVID-19 pandemic. It was clear to all of us here that we were living and are living still through a very historical and significant period in Virginia's long history, and we wanted to ensure that that story could be told for future generations and that it was well documented as part of our collection. So, so we began to collect stories from people online. And not long after businesses began closing, Wendy Martin of Richmond, Virginia, documented part of her COVID-19 experience by sharing 164 photographs of signs posted on the windows of Carytown businesses here in Richmond that in various ways announced their temporary closure or changes in their business plan. So here on the left, you can see the first sign that she documented, which was the closed sign for a record store, Deep Groove Records. And on the right, you can see the sign that she photographed for the Buffalo Exchange. And so we have really a remarkable collection now of Wendy's photographs as part of our Share Your Stories initiative. Cammie Olson of Chesterfield County submitted a story about her daughter, who you can see here in two photographs that she submitted. Stephanie is a nurse at New York City's Presbyterian Hospital Weill Cornell Medical Center. And you can see here her here on the left in all of her personal protective equipment as she was dealing directly with COVID-19 patients in the city that was arguably hardest hit by the pandemic. Until May of last year, Stephanie's home was in Virginia. And in the summer before she graduated from James Madison University, she traveled with a group of JMU nurses to Tanzania. And you can see her here with a big smile with some of the people that she helped, working in remote villages, delivering babies and providing whatever care was necessary. In her story, her mother wrote that in spite of all of her training, nothing could prepare Stephanie for the world of COVID-19. She's a new nurse in constant contact with a deadly virus, working long night shifts, trying to stay healthy, and taking critical care classes online to add to her knowledge during this desperate time. She said, "We are immensely proud of Steph, but we worry endlessly and our hearts are heavy. Gone are those not so distant days when I could protect her, hold her when she was scared, nurse her back to health when she was sick." And then she closed by saying, "Thank you for reading our story, and please keep my baby girl and all of her colleagues worldwide in your thoughts and prayers." And of course, we continue to do that here. And we've actually been in contact with Stephanie to try to collect some personal items that she has been using during her experience in New York. As another example, we received a submission in the mail from Malcolm Jordan, who's an inmate at Greensville Correctional Center near Jarrett, Virginia. And he was very interested in sharing his story. And after an exchange of letters, we received this response on June 1st, 2020. I know you're not able to read it on screen, but I will read some of the some highlights. He said, "We all fear for our own health as well as the health of our families, who we are unable to comfort during this crisis. We are all sons of elderly, high-risk parents, and most of us are fathers of children who need help coping with the crisis. We are currently on lockdown in our two-man cells and aren't being told how long we will be in here." And then he closed by saying that he would like future generations to know that inmates are people too. And so lastly, I wanted to focus on an object that we received to our collection, a physical object, in the form of this beer can. So soon after businesses started closing, Strange Way Brewing in Richmond decided to package a number of their beers in a container that featured a pandemic background. So you can see here people wearing face masks. And then they sort of summed up how a lot of people were feeling about the situation we were all in, and they titled their beer can, "COVID-19 Sucks." So this can is now a part of our collection, and we're also collecting a number of objects that you all are sending in, as well as objects from other businesses that adapted to the pandemic and we're trying to help their communities. So if you have a story that you want to share, I would encourage you to do so by sending us an email at sharec19story@virginiahistory.org. We are very interested in knowing, how you've been, how things have been going with you and what your experiences are. We understand that these can be painful times, and we're here and we'll continue to be here. So when you're ready to tell your story, we'll be ready to receive it. And so now I'm happy to turn the program over to my colleague, Dr. William Rasmussen, who is at his home office, social distancing, and to talk about some other parts of our collection.
Thank you, Andy. Andy mentioned that one of the jobs of a curator is to identify gaps in the collection and then let the word go forth to potential donors that we would welcome gifts in those areas. And one huge gap involves two of the many military wars that fill the 20th century, wars in which Virginians served honorably. We have very little from the Korean War and from the Vietnam War. So we invite Virginians who served in those wars to place with us uniforms and materials from those experiences. And it's important that we get the stories to go with the uniforms. We're not in the business of displaying U.S. uniforms. We're only interested in them because they're worn by Virginians who served in those wars. And then what we can offer in return is that we can guarantee that those gifts will be preserved, potentially forever. And that's a responsibility that that potential donors have to deal with. I recently gave a military uniform that descended in my family, and I was relieved of the burden of preserving it. So you may have noticed I did not mention the Gulf Wars. The Gulf Wars have been going on for the last 30 years, all of the lifetime of some people, of many people. And that's because we've received an extraordinary trove of several dozen gifts, 30 or 40 gifts, from a distinguished veteran of those wars. His name is Greg Ains, E-A-N-E-S. He was a U.S. Air Force intelligence officer. He retired in 2011. That was one of his uniforms. That's the one that he wore when he was Captain Ains, serving in the first Gulf War. He retired in 2011 after 34 years of service. He lives in Crewe in Nottoway County. And he's a very special person, not only for his service, but because he's an historian. He's written 16 history books that tell stories about American wars. And these stories tend to relate to his neck of the woods in sort of central Western Virginia. So examples, Tarleton's raid during the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, the Battle of Sailor's Creek, stories from World War I and World War II. And he even, this was 40 years ago, he even found a 100-year-old veteran from the Spanish-American War of 1899 to interview. So it tells us he's been writing for a long time. And he actually started when he was 14. His father published a newspaper, and he kept asking his father to interview some of the World War II veterans to learn their stories. And his father finally said, "You do it." So he did. And he's been interviewing for a long time, and he's very good at it. We met Greg Ains when he emailed us from Afghanistan in 2001, 2002, when he realized that he was in the midst of history unfolding. And so he emailed his state history museum with a report of the optimism of the Afghan people at that moment, just after the US had invaded following 9/11. And our military was very successful for October and November of 2001. And of course, this was before the Taliban had a resurgence in 2003, and it's been downhill since then. And then 15 years later, as we were preparing to redo our installations and noticed we were lacking uniforms from the Gulf Wars, we got in touch with Greg Ains, and he gave us 34 years worth of uniforms, as well as all sorts of unique materials from the Iraq invasion of 2003. I'm going to show you several more of those in a minute. But I'm getting ahead of the story, my story. So let me tell you about his service in chronological order, because there are so many of those wars, it gets confusing. He's a veteran of all of them. I mean, it's starting with the Iran hostage crisis in 1990 to 91. So here's his uniform that you're looking at that he wore when he was in the first Gulf War of 1990 to 91. And you remember it started with when the first President Bush put together a coalition of 34 nations to protect Saudi Arabia, because Saddam Hussein of Iraq had invaded Kuwait, had taken Kuwait. And so the President Bush launched Desert Shield to shield Saudi Arabia for invasion, because Saddam Hussein looked like he was going to keep going to conquer another oil-rich country. And then after that, we launched Operation Desert Storm to liberate Kuwait. Greg Ains played a role in U.S. Air Force intelligence in the determination of targets and in the collecting of war crimes, and he earned a Bronze Star for that service. And then, we jump a decade later, was when he was in Afghanistan as a counterintelligence officer, when he emailed us, and this is in the post 9/11 operations. You remember that the Taliban had allowed Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden a base of operations from which the 9/11 attacks were launched. And so Greg Ains was there with the US invasion of 2001 to 2003. He earned an Oak Leaf Cluster for that service. And we have a second uniform to show you, because he's been promoted to Colonel Ains. And well, we're going to show you a flag first. This and the uniform all deal with the Iraq invasion of 2003. And by the way, if any of you read Arabic, a lot of this material he gave us, we need some help. We would love to have some help because there are a number of posters and other objects with writing on them that we don't read. So the Iraqi flag you showed, he gave us a number of posters that are really quite interesting, to say the least. And there's Saddam Hussein in the right. This is after the first President Bush had pushed him back into Iraq, but he had regrouped there. He was obviously completely in control, and he doesn't look very remorseful for that reason, and showing that his military is very strong. So we have a number of posters that Greg Ains was able to pick up. And the reason he was able to pick up so much information is because he was playing an important role. He was involved in the pointless search for weapons of mass destruction, since there weren't any, but he was involved in the interrogation of prisoners. He was very good at that. And so he was interrogating high-value detainees, including the Prime Minister, Tariq Aziz, and Ali Hassan, who became famous as Chemical Ali. So we saw the Iraqi flag. He gave us 2 Kuwaiti flags, all sorts of Iraqi uniforms, Iraqi gas masks that we have displayed in our Story of Virginia exhibition. He gave us Iraqi clothing. Here's the uniform that Lieutenant Colonel Ains wore, and throughout that time in Iraq, he gave us a group of like 10 Iraqi trophy hats, these berets with an Iraq symbol and the flag in the center of it, Iraqi prayer rugs, a U.S. newspaper, copies of a U.S. newspaper that was published for the U.S. troops in Iraq, and the memorable deck of playing cards that were produced that had the faces of 52 of the most sought after villains of Saddam Hussein's regime. So, and I think we have it as Andy has at his reach the helmet that goes with this uniform that you're looking at. So he wore that in Iraq, and he played such an important role there that he was able to. He was going everywhere and collecting all sorts of information, and the historian in him realized that this was worth saving, and so we're very grateful for that collection. We have collections of this magnitude for World War I and World War II. I think with the World War II collection, I think of Samuel Bonsack, who was a VPI graduate right at the beginning of World War II. He served in the Pacific through the entire war, even through the occupation of Japan. He left us everything. Everything from his undershirts and socks, every bit of his uniforms, and including supporting materials. For example, he had a cloth seal from a Japanese crashed plane that's in that material. So we're very strong leading up to the Korean War, very strong after the Vietnam War. We need some help in between. So I will turn it over to Andy, who'll turn it over to one of my other colleagues.
Okay, I'll go ahead and jump right in because I'm the next curator to present. I'm Karen Sherry. I'm a curator of museum collections here at the museum, and along with my colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome you to this program today and want to echo Andy's thanks for your support and your involvement. I'm going to talk today about another area of our collection that we're actively trying to build to fill in long historical gaps, and that is our collection of materials related to African American history. People of African descent have been in Virginia since 1619, but they haven't always been well represented in the collections of our museum and library. So this is something we're actively trying to redress, and it's a task that has taken on particular urgency today in light of the of recent events, the past several weeks of protests and a real reckoning that our nation is having with systemic racism and persistent disparities around the issue of race that we all as Americans are confronting today. And I think one of the responsibilities of a historical museum like ours is to be able to present the truth of that history. A truth is sometimes very painful, often very ugly, but also is full of inspiring stories of perseverance and achievement. So as I say, one of our recent collecting initiatives has been along the lines of building our holdings of materials related to African American history from across the centuries. And one of our recent acquisitions is going to come up on the screen in a moment. It's quite a large and extraordinary document. This is a large canvas that measures about 9 feet by 11 feet. And it records the family tree of a family of African descent that arrived in Yorktown, Virginia in 1741 as victims of the slave trade. And this particular family tree, which relates to the Blackwell family, was created by a family member and kind of the family genealogist, a woman named Thelma Doswell. And this is one of 3 family trees she created on canvas, and it records more than 5,000 descendants of this Blackwell family that had its roots in West Central Africa, and as I say, came to Virginia as part of the international slave trade and has spread across the world. Present-day descendants live in over 15 countries around the world. So it's a little difficult to see from the slide, but some of you may have seen this artifact in person. It was on view in the Determined exhibition that we recently closed at the museum. And the various branches of the tree document all of these descendants who include the tennis great and humanitarian Arthur Ashe Jr. So this is quite an extraordinary document about the family of a Virginia Black family. Another recent acquisition is a group of Civil War muster and payroll documents related to the 30th Regiment of the USCT, the United States Colored Troops, who fought in the Civil War. And we have several of these documents from this regiment that are really important historical documents because they give us the name and place of origin of some of these Black soldiers who were fighting for the Union cause, a fight that was deeply personal to them and their families, a fight to end slavery in the United States. So these muster rolls, they give us the list of their names, where they were from, and also a little bit of information about their service. And what's particularly interesting about the 30th Regiment is that this regiment, and therefore many of the men listed on these muster rolls, fought in the Battle of the Crater. And so in the descriptive portion of these documents, it lets us know where they fought, sometimes the fact that they were injured or that they lost equipment in the battles. A regular comment is also that the men were sick, and that's a testimony to the health problems that ravaged servicemen during this war. So this is a really powerful document for us to have. It adds to the depth of strength that we have in Civil War history here in Virginia, yet it also provides insight specifically into the service of African American soldiers. Another recent acquisition is a cache of materials we got from Janae Sebron from her 2018 graduation from Virginia Tech. And Janae Sebron has a distinction of being the first female nanoscience graduate in the state of Virginia. And when we learned about that, we reached out to her to see if she would donate some items related to her academic career to the collection. And lucky for us, she was thrilled to do so. And a couple of the items are pictured in this graduation photograph that her family also shared with us. She gave us her mortar board, which she'd personalized with her distinction as being the first Black female nanoscience graduate. She also gave us several of her academic sashes and cords, which she was rewarded for her participation in various groups and also various clubs and organizations at Virginia Tech, and also for various honors she received. I hope that these few acquisitions I've shown you up till now have given you a sense of the range of materials we're collecting that represent different generations, different periods, and different aspects of the Black experience here in Virginia. And we're also continuing to collect today. We're reaching out for materials related to the recent protests, as my colleague Andy mentioned. We're also trying to identify the people who are making history today, who will be the important historical figures of tomorrow. And one of those people is this adorable young woman named Belen Woodard. She came to our attention through one of our educators who saw a news story about Belen. Belen is a 4th grader. She's 9 years old and she goes to school in Loudoun County. And she, from her experience as a student, kind of recognized this problem that she was struggling with. And that's when she and her classmates were coloring. Classmates would often turn and ask her to pass the skin-colored crayon. And she always felt a little anxious about that because there wasn't a crayon available that reflected her skin tone. And she also came to recognize that when her classmates were asking for the skin-colored crayon, they were often expecting to get the peach-colored crayon, the crayon that, at least since I was a kid, was linked to representing white people. And so Belen took this remarkable initiative to set up a project and a nonprofit called Belen's More Than Peach Project. And this is a project in which she assembles coloring kits. And you can see 2 of the kits that she recently gave to the museum on a visit she and her family made early in March before we all shut down for the COVID crisis. And what Belen does is she assembles kits that include a sketch pad and then some coloring items, either a packet of crayons or colored pencils or the like. And then she distributes these kits to schools in order to provide students with a greater range of hues and colors with which to draw the diversity of the human race. And this is a project that is really taking off, and it kind of underscores how extraordinary Belen is. She, as I said, established this nonprofit project. They have provided, I talked to her mom just a couple of weeks ago, to date they've provided more than 2,000 of these coloring kits to schools throughout Virginia, and they're starting to go more broadly. They've been contacted by the Chicago public school system about these kits. And what's so remarkable about Belen and her vision, she's a 9-year-old kid, is that she is using a business model that leverages both private donations, but also sells some of these kits. So she earns money through selling the kits, through taking donations, so that she can then provide these kits free of charge to school districts who need them. And this is definitely someone at age 9 we want to keep our eyes on, because she has recently branded her own special pack of crayons that include a broad range of skin tone crayons. So these kits, starting at the end of this summer, are going to include her own special brand as well. This little presentation has given you a sense of some of the range of items we're collecting to represent Black history here in Virginia. So I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Paige Newman.
Thank you, Karen. Hi, my name is Paige. I'm the manuscript collection curator here, and I've been with the institution since 2003. In addition to working with manuscripts, it also includes newspapers and maps. And when I mention manuscripts, manuscripts encapsulates a lot, and some dimension are letters and diaries, journals, Bible records, wills, deeds, estate inventories, and scrapbooks. And Andy mentioned before also that includes business records. So in addition to working with the manuscripts, I answer reference questions, assist the library, research, develop ideas for exhibits and programs, and help promote access to our collections. Since June is recognized as Pride Month, I thought I would focus on a few items from our lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer, or as I'll be saying, LGBTQ+ collections. Many of our records date from the mid-1970s to the 1990s and reflect the grassroots efforts of alliances and associations created by the gay, lesbian, and bisexual community. So some of our records span over longer periods of time and are the personal papers of individuals such as Stephen Michael Linton, who was born in California, but was a long-term resident of Richmond, Virginia. He was a Peace Corps volunteer, VCU University Assistant Dean of Student Life, professional therapist, and a political and gay rights activist. The papers represent his life experience and perspective as an emerging gay man in the last half of the 20th century, which is preserved in his diaries, his scrapbooks, correspondence, writings, lesson plans, and oral history interviews. Another is we have the papers of Guy N. Kinman, who died in 2018 at the age of 100. He was a minister and a former Navy chaplain and longtime Richmond activist for LGBTQ+ rights. His papers also include scrapbooks, lines of verse, magazine and newspaper clippings. And we also have a research award named after him, which is the Guy Kinman Award, and it's made possible by Diversity Richmond and supports work on such topics as LGBTQ+ studies, civil rights, and issues affecting minority communities. Okay, so let's get to the slides. And pull that flag back up, which is from the Virginia Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual Community Center. The center began in Richmond, Virginia in July 1993 as a nonprofit organization to provide educational, cultural, spiritual, social, and community service programs for the gay, lesbian, and bisexual community. The center sponsored local programs and campaigned for funds to open the center, but officially dissolved in June 1995 before any such center was created. Materials in this collection include agendas, brochures, bylaws, certificates of incorporation and dissolution, correspondence, financial reports, minutes, and newsletters. So we're moving on to the second slide, which is the 2014 Virginia Pride Fest. Pride Fest is planned and implemented by Virginia Pride, which is a nonprofit that was started in the mid-1970s. Its goal is to bring awareness to the community and to promote diversity while enabling unity among the Richmond LGBT community members. The next slide is another program from 1996, Alive with Pride Festival and Parade. This event was organized by the Richmond Lesbian and Gay Pride Coalition, which was founded in the 1980s to promote lesbian and gay pride in and around the city of Richmond. So a recent donation kind of offers some unique items, as Andy's showing. So this recent donation is from Judd Proctor and Brian Burns. Proctor, a LGBTQ historian and gay rights activist who met Burns in 1995, and they were married in Massachusetts in 2006. In 2005, Proctor launched the Rainbow Minute, a radio segment about LGBTQ heroes, history, and culture. With the help from Burns, he has produced over 2,000 episodes. So in addition to what Andy's showing, the collection includes research files accumulated for the Rainbow Minute radio series, books, magazines, comic books, audiovisual material, posters and images from gay pride events and protests, and artifacts that represent LGBTQ history and culture, such as the action figures Andy is showing. So one of them, you'll see Alexander the Great, or Alexander III of Macedon. He's the king of Macedonia who overthrew the Persian Empire and thought to have had sexual relationships with both men and women. The next is Anne Bonny, a female Irish American pirate who plundered the Caribbean with male pirates in the 18th century and is thought to have had relationship with another female pirate, Mary Read. And the other, Barbie, Rosie O'Donnell Barbary. So as you probably well know, she's a comedian, actress, and television personality, and she's an advocate for lesbian rights and gay adoption issues. So I hope this gives you an interesting really view of all the types of things we do collect, and hope that we are committed to telling more than an inclusive story of Virginia and representing the LGBTQ community in one way is to share this important part of Virginia history. So I'll turn it back over to Andy.
So I really appreciate all of my colleagues talking about these wonderful projects that they've been involved in. And I know that this has probably inspired a lot of you to think about things that you have that may benefit the collection of the Virginia Museum of History and Culture and could be helpful for future generations to understand either events that are happening today that are making history or even past events that will allow us to fill gaps in our collections. So if you're interested in donating to the collection, there are a couple of ways to do that. The best way is to go to our website, to the web address here, virginiahistory.org/collections/donating collections, where there's a form you can fill out with information about the objects or manuscripts or records that you would like to donate. Or you can simply email me at atalcob@virginiahistory.org, and I'll certainly pass along your message to the appropriate curator who will get back to you. So now, the part you've all been waiting for, I'm sure, is the opportunity for you to ask us your questions. So we're all ready, and you can type your question in the question and answer box, and we'll be glad to answer any questions that you have. Oh, and all of the panelists can see the questions that you're asking, so they can jump in if they want to. So one of the questions that was asked, sent in before the program began was how long it takes to process a collection. And the answer, of course, varies depending on the size of the collection. So some large manuscript collections can take, years to completely process. But an individual object can be processed relatively quickly. What takes even more time, though, is because we know that you all look at our online catalog to see the types of objects and collections that we have. Sometimes, especially on our object collection side, it takes longer to make that information available online. So it can take some time for the object to be photographed, of which, with a 9 million object collection, we have quite a backlog of photography that we want to do before we can make some items available online as images. And then there's a process of clearing records to be made available online. So we're working as quickly as we can to make as much of our collections accessible that way. Of course, if you have a question about an object that you've either seen in the museum or that you think we have, or that you're not sure we might have but want to know if we have, you can certainly email me or one of my curatorial colleagues for that. We can try to answer that. So one of the questions that we have is, where do you store your collection? So all 9 million items in our collection are stored in the building that you come to visit when you visit the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. There are multiple levels of storage, and the collection is divided into various areas. So there are areas where we store our manuscript collection, areas where we store our painting collections, areas where we store our firearms collections, and of course our books are stored in an area that is specific to those spaces. But we have all of our collections right here, very securely located in our building. Looking at some of the other questions that have come in. One of the questions is, what are some of the types of items that we do not accept or do not need or want? So would any of my colleagues like to talk a little bit about the types of things we would really like and the types of things that we may not be as interested in collecting?
I'll jump in, Andy, to start, and just to answer the part of the question, what we are looking for. Certainly the collection areas that we discussed today are some of our current collecting initiatives, areas that we've determined we don't have strength and we don't have adequate materials to be able to represent those stories and tell that history. As far as what we are not looking for the collection, that's a little harder question to answer. There are some absolutes that are just part of best practices for museums. We don't collect human remains. We don't collect items that perhaps belong to Native American tribes and are related to their spiritual and religious and burial practices. And for everything else, we kind of vet it based on a set of collecting criteria. And some of those criteria include items that relate to Virginia history, items that are in good condition, items that we can reasonably care for and store, because when we do take an artifact into our collection, we make the commitment to care for that and store that in perpetuity. So we have to be sure that the museum can handle it. We also tend to try to avoid duplication in our collection. So if we have deep holdings in, I'm just going to pull this out of thin air, for example, 1950s cookbooks, and somebody offers us another collection of 1950s cookbooks that duplicate items already in our collection, chances are we're not going to accept that. So those are some of the criteria by which we collect, and I hope that it's not a very specific answer, but we do consider offers on a case-by-case basis, and those are the criteria by which we vet offers.
Another way to answer that, the first hurdle to clear is I think Karen already touched on this. It's got to relate to Virginia specifically. It's got to relate to Virginia history. It's got to have an importance. And another factor with certain things like furniture, for example, there is a finite amount of storage space. And if it's a large piece of furniture, we've got to be more selective in terms of what we accept. So I guess the only thing we can say for certain is that every item is going to be looked at specifically, one by one.
Okay, another question from our viewers is what do you need to do in order to become a curator? I can say that oftentimes curators of at museums have a particular specialty. Paige, has a specialty in manuscript collections. Bill, Karen, and I all have areas of specialty. Typically, being a curator requires an advanced degree. Some museums require a PhD in a particular field. But I think that in addition to education, experience working with collection objects. And here at the museum, our curators are also responsible for developing exhibitions. And so our curators and many curators, use their knowledge and skill to interpret collections to the public through publication, through programming, and through exhibition. And so some experience doing exhibitions is also an important criteria for being a curator. Does any of my colleagues want to chime in with some thoughts?
I mean, I have a Master's of Library Science, is what's fairly required for archival work, but also it's now that, I mean, I went to school, I feel like a long time ago, so now there's more options out there. But yes, yeah, definitely need a master's up to doctorate level, which Karen and Bill can respond to.
Well, I think Andy and Paige have covered it. It's generally a combination of some kind of academic expertise and then also hands-on experience.
And we don't always start out thinking we're going to be curators. We may have thought we were going to do something else and then found that really this is actually perhaps a more important job than, for example, teaching on the college level, which is something that was on my mind as I went through graduate school. But I'm after decades of doing this, I think I made the right decision. Back to you, Andy. That's what the newscasters always say.
Thank you, Bill. So another question by Delmas Moore, I hope I've pronounced your name correctly, asks, has the VMHC been involved yet in any discussions about the future placement of statues from Monument Avenue or elsewhere in Virginia? The answer to that question is that we have been, of course, monitoring the discussion that's been happening in communities all over Virginia about the future of Confederate monuments and other types of public sculpture. And the museum hasn't really been involved in any discussions about the future of those monuments, but we are interested in these discussions as these discussions in and of themselves are historic. And so our efforts really now are focused on trying to collect and document items related to the recent protests, as Karen suggested, as well as to the discussions about what will happen or what localities are planning to do with their monuments, so that this period in history is documented. But no, we haven't been involved in any discussions about the final location or disposition of those monuments. David Steele asked, he wrote, Many of the books, letters, anecdotes, and stories that have been passed down to me from my Virginia ancestors are used to affirm a dominant narrative. Even one story about an ancestor prohibiting the education of free Negroes, quote unquote, was transmitted as evidence of my people's, quote unquote, nobility. He said, can you talk about the process the museum must undertake to reevaluate and in some cases reframe the artifacts of our history? It's an excellent question. Would any of my colleagues like to talk a little bit about that?
I'm happy to jump in here, and it is, I think, a critically important question, especially right now. And this is a process that the museum has been undergoing for a little while, but it does need to take new urgency. And I think it's a problem that's not unique to our museum. Many museums and cultural sites across the nation are contending with this and are indeed reevaluating what they do and how they tell stories that are truthful and inclusive and representative of the diversity and totality of our history. And I think that what a few of the things that we're taking on as a museum, those of you who've been members with us for a while, you've probably noticed in the past couple years a really decided change in our programming that embraces a much broader story of Virginia's history in terms of the variety of lecture topics that we present, our Created Equal film series, and exhibitions like the Determined exhibition, which was about 400 years of African-American history. A real challenge in doing that programming, however, is often the challenge of finding artifacts, because for so much of our nation's history, and this is kind of a maybe an adage that does hold some truth, is that history has been told by the victors. So a real challenge we have is coming up with the materials and finding the artifacts to tell stories that were not deemed worthy of telling for so much of our nation's history, and also for which we don't necessarily have the artifacts or documents. It does often require a little bit of curatorial creativity. We might not have a lot of information about, for an example, an enslaved Virginian who was living in the, say, 18th century, but maybe we have the records of the slaveholder who held that person. Maybe one thing we can try to do is take those slaveholder records and tease out the hidden stories, the hidden history of those enslaved individuals. I think as we move forward as an institution, we're also going to be reevaluating the interpretive material that we have in our galleries on our website. I ask you all to be patient with us. We have a very small staff, so it does sometimes take a little while to change something like, it might sound simple, but to change a label in a gallery actually requires the coordination of a lot of efforts and a lot of staff people within the museum, so that takes some time. Similarly with editing our website, but we are planning to review and to change and to make sure that our presentation is as truthful and as authentic as we can make it. So I'm happy for my other colleagues to jump in as well, or we can turn to another question.
Yeah, I think Karen answered it on the manuscript side with cataloging. You know, talking 20, 30, 40, 50 years earlier, there was a lot, cataloging was different. And now, today, we are pulling out information of all Virginians, enslaved women, and just pulling out more information to give more context to the history. And it is time consuming, considering, you know, a lot of our larger collections, you know, there are thousands of items, and having to go back through and rework and reread just to pull out what needs to be noted.
And I'll just mention that, you know, one experience that I've had since I've been here is that in the early in the early 2010s, you know, we began a project called Unknown No Longer, which is a database of slave names that is accessible online. Maybe Haley can put the link in the notes. But what's really interesting about that project is that the museum had vast collections of plantation records of elite Virginians from the, you know, 18th and 19th centuries, who had often been mined for information about the owners of the plantation. And I think what was really fascinating about that project is that it flipped the script on how historians looked at those documents, which is something that historians are doing with a lot of documents, looking at them from a different angle. And it was remarkable how much information those documents revealed about the life of enslaved people, and simply gave name to a population of Virginia enslaved people that may not have been really the priority for historians in the past. And so I think that was a great example of looking at a collection in a different way to address the question that you had. So we've run up against our hour, and I really appreciate all of these wonderful questions. If you had a question that didn't get answered, you have my email in the notes, so please feel free to email me and we'll make sure that you get your question answered. I also wanted to thank you all for being supporters of the VMHC. And as a member, we really couldn't do this without you. If you are interested in more curator conversations, we actually have another program this Thursday that is specifically for our 1831 Society members. These are members who have donated $1,000 or more. And if you are interested in joining that programming and upgrading your membership, you can contact Elizabeth Darling, our manager of membership and annual giving at edarling@virginiahistory.org. So for all of us here at the museum, I wish you an excellent day and stay safe, and we'll see you at our next curator conversation.
Bye, thanks.
See ya. Thank you all.